Now, I won't dare try and do some journalist jokes, because they do say the pen is mightier than the sword. Okay, my section is to deal with risks in retirement, so I hope you've all filled up and you energized for the next session. So what are we trying to achieve? I think before we look at the risks, you need to have a look at what are your objectives in retirement, because the risk that we're going to be looking at is in relation to what your objectives are. So for those of you in the room, have you ever thought about what are your objectives in retirement? So either if you now in retirement or close to retirement, what are those? Are they family holidays? Leaving money for family and some legacy? What about certainty of monthly income? Is that an objective for you? Capital preservation or maximizing the return from your investments? Or do you just want to play golf? And I was quite disappointed because outside we've got a little golf course going there. I didn't see anybody playing too much golf and testing out the clubs, so maybe we don't have many golfers out here. I'm just glad some of you used the nice reclining beach chairs out there. But the point is, everybody's needs are different. No one person is the same. Your family structure is different. Where you live is different. So what people would need in Durban, because they go surfing and doing a whole lot of things, is different from what you do in Johannesburg, as an example. So how do you manage all of those particular things? So when we talk about what are your objectives, we'd like to say there's a primary objective in terms of your retirement capital. And the primary objective should actually be to sustain a standard of living throughout retirement. And those are quite important words. So the first thing is to sustain a standard of living. It's about making sure that throughout your retirement, you can maintain that, taking into account all the risks we're going to talk about. So what we don't want is up on the slides over there. And what this is trying to show your retirement assets providing you with an income. The top graph shows you a very volatile income. So in this particular retirement strategy, you can see that you start off quite well, but it's very volatile as the markets move, the kind of income that you're getting. And when you're in retirement, I'm sure a lot of people don't want that kind of volatility, that you're not sure the next month how much your investment is going to give you as an income. You need more stability. Also, you don't want the bottom graph. The bottom graph, you start off with a reasonable pension, but then as you go through retirement, 20, 30 years on, you actually find that it's not sustainable. So your assets are giving you less than your expenses. And those are the times when people then start doing things that might have implications later on because they're no longer able to afford a lot of things. The other important point is that when you enter retirement, I think a lot of people these days still have the ability to contribute and do certain things and supplement their income with, as I mentioned previously, a second job. As you go into retirement, the ability to be able to supplement your income reduces. So it's quite important that you take that into account within your retirement plan. So what do we want? What we want in retirement as the primary objective is stability of income, an income for life, and maintaining the standard of living. So all the risks that I'm going to be talking about are the risks in achieving this particular objective. So there are many risks in ensuring that you can sustain an income in retirement. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 4 big risks, and then we'll talk about a couple of others. And Bruce has a few of his own that he'd like to add as well in his presentation. The risk number 1 is longevity, as we spoke about earlier, and that is living longer and running out of income in retirement, which for many people in South Africa is becoming more and more of a reality. Inflation is the second big risk, and Gareth talked about how important in looking at inflation is, and that is where your income over time doesn't keep pace with inflation and what you require. Then another risk that we haven't yet touched on today is what's called consumption risk, and that is where you are consuming more than your financial plan can sustain. And I think a lot of people don't look at this risk and do certain things and only realize 30 years down the line that, oops, I shouldn't have spent so much relative, it's not sustainable, but unfortunately by then it's too late. So that's a very, very important risk to be aware of. The other major risk is income conversion. You remember that previously I said many funds today are of a defined contribution nature, which means that you're accumulating your investments and contributions with returns, and when you get to retirement, you must make a decision of how to convert it into an income. That is probably the most important decision you will make, and you must do it right, because I think, unfortunately, we only have one retirement. We're not able to reset the play button like they do in the Matrix when they go back and reboot and play it again. You only have one retirement. So it's quite important that when you do make the decisions, you're making the right decisions, weighing up all the different things that you need to look at. So let's unpack each of these risks in a little bit more detail. Longevity. This is a picture of Sid Pryor, and he's a gentleman that is overseas, and he finally retired in 2011, and he was 97 years old. That is happening today. A colleague of mine was telling me the other day, his mother, she's 95 and she still works. But I'm wondering if it's because he hasn't moved out of home yet, so she has to sustain him. But the point is, these things are happening. I don't know if you would have seen in a newspaper earlier this year, a lady in KwaZulu-Natal turned 131. This is a South African who turned 131. Just think about that. Born in 1883. Went through all the different wars, seen the depression, all of those different things, 131. And that's not some country overseas, that's here in South Africa. And this is a reality. So 50% is the likelihood that if you're 60 years old, you or your spouse or partner will be alive at age 90, on average, in South Africa. And one day when my son retires in 2075, he'll have an 85% chance that him or his partner will be alive at age 90. It's almost 100%. And what we do know is that actuaries and people who do demographics have historically underestimated the rate at which people are living. We've always underestimated it. And that's unfortunately the actuarial profession. We are 50%, we get it above the line, 50% below, but 100% of the time we're wrong. So, see, I can make my own actuary jokes as well. So let's have a look at the last 21 years of mortality improvements. And this is a line, this tries to see how mortality has improved in South Africa. How we did it was we looked at the kind of valuation bases that actuaries would use in valuing funds in South Africa. And we can actually see a strong positive improvement in mortality. And you can see there for ages above age 76, don't worry about the detail, you can have a look in your packs later on. But on average, we've seen about a 1% per annum improvement in mortality from ages 76 up. That means every year, the new generation of 76-year-olds is living 1% longer than the previous generation, and so we carry on. And those of you who know the magic of compound interest, this adds up to quite a bit over time. If we look at the younger ages, though, we can see that there's been a major improvement in the longevity of females relative to males. We can only speculate as to why that is the case. I don't know if you watch Crime and Investigation Network. There are some stories about people when they get a lot of assets close to retirement, what the wife does to the husband and some of the methods over there. That'll account for the gap. No, I'm only joking. In all seriousness, these curves were never meant for that kind of, so don't read too much into the left-hand side of the graph. The curves were more appropriate for the right-hand side. So on average, 1% per annum over the last 21 years. And South Africa is typically behind the curve. So what we've seen in the UK, they've experienced 3%, 4% per annum, sustainably over the last 20, 30 years. That is what South Africa is in for. So this is only the start. We're going to expect it to continue. So what does that mean for you? You need to manage the risk and make sure that your plan is sustainable for a longer and longer period as you go on. Let's look at the other risk, inflation risk. Gareth talked about it, and he had his slide. Here's my slide of what 1,000 Rand can buy you. 1970, anybody here bought a car in 1970? You paid roughly 1,000 Rand for the model that we've got up there. 1980, you could get a nice motorbike. 1990, a bicycle. Today, roughly, you get a good pair of shoes, and in 2020, maybe some socks, depending on how inflation goes. But also, the other part of inflation is also when the costs are rising and you're getting less and paying more. And that was the quote over there with a haircut. The major thing on inflation, I'm not going to deal with all the other aspects, but I do want to highlight the importance of medical inflation. And you saw the lady in the video talking about, I would like a fixed annuity for life. Now, the issue you need to be aware of there is it going to keep pace with inflation? And this is the reason why. All other inflation is going up, but medical inflation in South Africa has sustainably gone up between 2 and 3% per annum more than your CPI. And healthcare inflation becomes very important for people in retirement. On average, 90% of this expenses that you'll spend in terms of healthcare will happen in the last 2 years of your life. So that's quite important. What does it mean? It means you need, at the time you need healthcare is right towards the end. Now, this is an example of an average individual starting off today with a pension, and 20% of his or her pension goes towards healthcare. And that's roughly what we've seen in the industry. So that's fine, because you've got 80% to do all the other things you'd like to do. However, if you get a pension and it only goes up with CPI, what happens in 5 years' time? The amount that you're going to be spending on healthcare has gone up, because remember, your healthcare component has gone up, your pension has only kept pace with inflation. So there, it's now 25% of every rand goes towards healthcare. In 10 years' time, it's going to be 30%. So you can see the healthcare costs go up and up. You have less and less on other things. Now, what happens if you don't have any inflation protection? And those are the blue bars. Again, you start off at 20%. In 5 years' time, almost 45% of your pension goes to healthcare costs. And within 10 years, the entire pension goes towards healthcare. And this is quite important, because we've seen many people that as they go into retirement, they experience this, and then they stop contributing towards medical. And that is the point that you need it the most. So it's quite important to build this into your plan, not just look at normal inflation, look at your inflation. Every one of us is different, but in particular, medical inflation, that you've accounted for it properly, because you will need it later on. So let's look at then the other big risk is consumption risk. And what do we really mean? Well, what we're talking about here is how much is enough. Remember earlier I talked about Tom, Reg, and Vusi, and we talked about the 75% pension. The question is 75% enough? And how do we manage it? So where does the 75% come from? Historically, internationally, people in research would say that between 70 and 80% is sufficient, and even 90% in certain countries, depending on what support is given to people in retirement, government pensions, and so forth. Historically, in South Africa, people used a rule of thumb of 60 to 75%. And the rationale behind it was that, I'm going to retire. I'm not going to spend as much. I don't need to travel to work. I'm going to be working more in the garden and a whole lot of other things. So my expenses are going to come down. My tax rate's going to come down. I don't need to save. And a whole lot of things. But more recently, some in-depth research was actually done in South Africa to see, is this the case? Is 60 to 75 the right kind of number? And this research was presented in 2011 at the Actuarial Convention. A colleague of mine, Megan Butler, actually produced a paper for those of you that are interested. But basically, what it tries to do is it analyzes the Statistics South Africa expenditure data. And it has a look at, for people before retirement and after retirement, do they actually spend less? Does their spending reduce? And what it basically means is, if you're on the left-hand side, it means you are spending less in retirement. If you're on the right-hand side, up to 100% means you're spending pretty much the same. And what you can notice is there's a steep line at roughly at about the 80 to 90%, 100% level, which means the majority of people observed in this particular study spent pretty much the same as they did before retirement. So what does that mean? It means that the old rules of thumb don't actually apply. Non-healthcare consumption does not decrease in retirement. You will be spending on different things. Just like when you were 20 compared to where you are now, you're spending on different things, but the expenditure doesn't go down. It can actually go up. Healthcare expenditure may, and in most cases will increase at retirement and as you go into retirement. Also, it's quite important, everybody uses this rule of thumb. The reality is that there is no one number. You need to sit down and look at your budget, your plan. You need to take into account, am I going to work in retirement to supplement my income? And will I have family support to work out what is the appropriate target for me? So the actual target differs by your household composition, income, home ownership. I'd like to spend just a quick one on home ownership, because a lot of people think owning a home is an asset. It's not an asset because it doesn't produce an income. And it's different from rental if you're getting a rental income from other property, but home ownership in terms of your primary residence, it's not an asset. It doesn't create an income. And what often happens with people is they build up a family, and when they get to retirement, the family moves out and they've got this big house, and they need to maintain the expenses. And that is very, very expensive. And that's one of the contributing factors towards expenses can actually be more, because now you're going to have to maintain this thing. And it actually happened to my mother-in-law. We can actually see it now. Father-in-law passed away, unfortunately, and she now has this big house, but she's struggling to move out and do things, and it's costing quite a lot. She needs more help to do a lot of things. So I think people do need to think about, what am I going to do about home ownership, and plan ahead for these particular things. The other major risk is income conversion risk. And you'll remember that I talked about a defined contribution fund. You must take your accumulated savings and convert it into an income. And that decision that you make can stay with you for the rest of your life. And there are two sections of risk here. The one is, do I choose a life annuity, meaning I buy a pension with an insurance company and they pay me a pension for life? Or do I take a living annuity? Bruce will talk about that. That's basically an income, it's a savings account in basic terms that you draw down. And when the money's finished, it's finished. Now, you have a choice between one or the other, or a combination between those particular things. So let's have a look at the risks associated with life annuities, or a pension that you buy from an insurer. This is a graph that shows Tom. He gets a quote from an insurance company in 2007, and he's got 1 million rand. And for the 1 million rand, he does the responsible thing, so he wants an inflation-related pension. He provides for a spouse, and he went into the market and he got the best quote out there. He was able to secure an income of 3,753 rands per month. The first thing you'll notice is 1 million rand only gives you 3,700 rand. And that's something we maybe talk about later. The point is, 7 years later, that same million rand, he goes to, again, Vusi goes out into the market, and he can secure an income of 3,200 rand. There's been a 500 rand reduction in what you can actually purchase with that. And have a look at those particular points in time. From month to month, you can actually secure a greater or lesser pension, depending on the timing that you got the quote. Now, what is happening here? What's happening here is that life annuities, depending on which option you take, the cost of it is linked to interest rates. So when Jill Marcus raises the interest rate, it becomes cheaper in many different options. When she lowers the rate because of quantitative easing and a whole lot of other things, the cost goes up. And you can see how the cost has gone up over the last number of years as interest rates have been at the lowest points in 30 years. It has, however, come up. The point is, if you're at that point where interest rates are very low, you take your 1 million rand and buy, you lock in to that for life. So that is a risk that you need to bear in mind, the timing of that decision. So to illustrate it differently, a lot of people think that the risk that if I lose capital, that's bad. It's not actually losing capital in rand terms, it's about securing an income. And what do we mean by that? This is an example of Reg. On 1 June 2013, he wants an income of 5,500 rand. To buy that from a life insurance company, it is going to cost him 1.8 million rand. He only has 1.5 million rand. which means he can only afford 80% of what he requires. 1 month later, on 1 July 2013, he still requires, it's just 1 month later, so it's 5,500 Rand. However, it now costs him 1.6 million Rand to buy that same 5,500 Rand. But his investment value, the markets went down, and in his portfolio, in this case, went down by 3.91. Many people will say, but that's bad, my investment went down. It's not actually bad, because my investment went down by 3.9, but the cost of securing and buying it was cheaper by 12%. So I'm 9% better off. So this is quite an important one. When you're at retirement, it's not about always capital preservation, it's about income preservation, which is a very different concept altogether. So what you want is a portfolio that does this, if this is the kind of structure that you need. Over there we see the green line is stable returns from a portfolio relative to the cost of purchasing an income. So the point is, it's not about getting the best return or preserving capital. Your portfolio must be structured according to making sure that it moves in relation to interest rates and the cost of purchasing an income. What about living annuities? What is the risk with that? Well, there are 3 risks that I'd like to take you through on living annuities. And Bruce has many more, I'm sure that he'd like to add. The first is having an inappropriate investment strategy. Why is that important? Well, 23 cents of what you're going to get as a pension. So if my pension is 1 Rand, 23 cents typically come from, based on the assumptions that we've calculated these on, come from the contributions you made over 30, 40 years. Only 23 cents. 36 cents come from the returns that you generated while you were working. 41 cents of every Rand comes from the returns generated after retirement. That is quite important. That is the point at which your assets are the greatest, and therefore you can get the greatest returns. However, it's also the point at which if you're exposed to the markets where it's very volatile, it can have a detrimental effect, and you've got to balance all of those particular objectives. Risk 2 is emotional switching in response to markets, and we've seen this time and time again. And what this graph tries to show, the black line, is how the markets move. So, for example, we had the tech bubble in 1999-2000. That's on the left-hand side when it's at the top. And then at the bottom, we had the crash in 2008. So that's the bottom. What typically happens is when the markets go up, everybody starts getting happy. You say, wow, I feel great about this investment. Let's do some more. You start talking at the braai. All of a sudden, all your friends become financial experts in this share and that share. That's warning bells, and you know there's a problem. And then what happens is the market starts turning. And when this market starts turning, people are like, no, it's a temporary setback, no worries. Then panic starts to go in, and then eventually people just say, you know what, I can't take these losses anymore, I'm pulling out. And the point is, that's the point when you're most at risk. I was talking to a colleague of mine outside, and he was saying that, that's usually the point where a lot of clients, a lot of pensioners do actually panic, and they do the wrong things, and they switch, for example, from equities into cash. And what you then do is you lock in those losses. And we did see it through the financial crisis. If I have a look at the ASISA and the flows of unit trusts, when the financial crisis was right at the bottom, lots of money going to cash because it was safe. All of a sudden, the market went up. Money went back into equities. And then there was the Greek crisis, and then there was back to cash. So the point is a lot of switching, and we've done some research into the value destruction on that. And for funds in South Africa, we've seen up between a 1% and 2% on average reduction in yield because of those kinds of things. Overseas, it can be even more, depending on which market you look at. The point is, emotional reaction can be your number one risk. So that is why it's quite important to, before you do a lot of things, just check, am I not overreacting? Am I not a long-term investor? Should I not do some other things? Then the last risk with living annuities is a drawdown rate's too high. That means that from day one, you're drawing too much, and it's not sustainable, and you're going to run out of money. But I'm going to leave that to Bruce because he's got quite a lot of interesting stats on that to give you some guidelines as to what is an appropriate drawdown rate. So let's end off with some of the other residual risks that people often don't consider. The first is family support and conflict. So historically, South Africa, there was a lot of family support. And over the last number of decades, we've seen a huge urbanization, which means that family support has broken away. So you can't really rely on family support anymore, as you would have in the past. Also conflicts. What we often see for people in retirement, especially if someone passes away, are things like how they structured the will. And it causes issues in the family, and I've experienced this myself, where people are, it really does a lot of damage. So the key thing there is to think very carefully, how do I structure my will? How do I make sure, rather have it independent so it doesn't cause issues within the family? And the other thing is, like, people feel that they need to leave bequests for, well, the thing is, you first need to look at my income to sustain me in retirement, because you might not have money left at the end of the day. The number one thing is income in retirement. If you have left, then maybe look at things like bequests. Catastrophic health or other loss, that is important. Even in retirement, you're not able to absorb as much of the risk. For example, what happens if your house burns down, your car, or some of those kinds of things? You need to make very, very sure that you're well protected for all of those particular risks. And then one that often doesn't get a lot of airtime is dementia. And why is this important? Well, there was a study done in Australia that actually showed that people, for Australians below the age of 75, they're able to manage money. So from age 75, the cognitive functions start deteriorating, that you start struggling to manage finances. Why is this important? That is the point in time where you're going to be most at risk and vulnerable. If you're not able to manage the money, you're going to start seeing either, it might be family, it could be property syndication schemes or other scams actually target people. They do target people. And you need to be aware of this. And this is a key issue, for example, for living annuities. A living annuity, you can still, dementia is a big issue you need to be aware of, because at some point maybe somebody else would have control of the money in there. Do you trust them? Is it structured appropriately? Are they independent? Or is it better to, rather than just get a pension for life, and I don't need to worry about those particular risks? So please do bear that in mind in your financial plan. And the last thing is fraud. People in this room and people into retirement, the point is you've built up assets, and you are being targeted, because of that. And we've seen, and Bruce has talked a lot in the personal finance about property syndication, other scams that people fall prey to. People are targeted, so you need to be aware of fraud, and you need to do proper homework and due diligence. Is this a decent investment? Are the investments in fact there? Not because the sales guy is a nice guy, he looks great, has a nice suit. You need to really do proper checks to make sure these are proper investments. So I hope that's given you a lot to think about in terms of the risks in retirement. My colleague Andrew is going to take you through some tips on how you can construct your financial plan to address these, and I'm sure Bruce will touch on a lot of the other risks. Thank you very much.